Well, Crispin Sartwell here. I thought I would discuss some of the refutations of the arguments for the legitimacy of state power that I give in my book, Against the State, An Introduction to Anarchist Political Theory. The first of these is classical social contract theory, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Now, the way I would summarize classical contract theory is that, according to it, a legitimate state, the legitimacy of a legitimate state, rests on the actual consent of the governed. Now, obviously, that kind of view lies at the heart of modern democracy. For example, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, it's actually cast in contract terms. We, the people, in order to do X, Y, and Z, do ordain and establish this Constitution. In classical contract theory, you generally have three phases. First, there's what's known in the description of the origin of legitimate states. You have the state of nature, that is, the state of human beings, a pre-political state of human beings. And in a state of nature, people are insecure. They're subject to predation from one another, for one thing. They're vulnerable to one another. And so they can't secure their lives and properties. And hence, as Hobbes says, life is nasty, brutish, and short. So they come together and they form a contract, and through that contract they establish a legitimate government by their voluntary act. So the three phases are state of nature, social contract, political state. Now, as an historical account of the origin of actual states, which is evidently what Hobbes and Locke had in mind, this view is at best naive. It's just not. That just doesn't seem to be the historical fact that that's the origin of legitimate states. The classic refutation of contract theory of that sort is given by David Hume in his essay Of the Original Contract. And he said, Hume was a historian, and he says, look, when we look at the actual origin of political states, we don't see a big meeting where everyone decides, okay, we're gonna establish a government. We see force, we see conquest, and that seems right. Now, another problem with contract theory is that it does not appear that most people have actually consented, at least not explicitly. And in fact, let me say this: I don't consent. I don't consent to be ruled by the United States government or the government of Pennsylvania. I mean, I don't know how else to say it or how else to express it. However, according to various versions of classical contract theory, that doesn't matter. I have consented. I've consented tacitly. And in general, classical contract theory requires a notion of tacit consent. And usually this amounts to mere residence. That is, the fact that I haven't left means that I implicitly consent to be governed by the government of the United States, let's say. All right, now this, again, the idea of tacit consent has been blown apart many times in many ways. It's not a particularly compelling sort of view, as Randy Barnett points out in his book Restoring the Lost Constitution. We wouldn't accept this as making a legitimate contract, for example, for renting a television. So, if someone brings me a television and chains it to my wall, makes it impossible for me or extremely difficult for me to remove that television, I have not contracted to accept it, and I'm not obliged to pay for it. I mean, in any reasonable construal of contract law. And the idea of tacit consent has been blown apart many times in many ways. I'd point you to Lysander Spooner's essay, No Treason, or also in in Barnett. Well, anyway, it's just not, doesn't seem to be a plausible view. Now, I make an even stronger argument against the state, and it's this: that the force and coercion which the state operates by definition, that is, a state is a group of people who enforce a effective monopoly of violence over a certain geographical area, that force itself precludes consent. Consent is conceptually out of play in a situation in which you are faced with overwhelming force. Consent is not a subjective state of an individual. It's a feature of the objective situation in which that individual is embodied. And a case in which I can either capitulate or by extraordinary means attempt to resist and face things like imprisonment or execution or exile is a state in which consent is not in play at all. Right? There's no possibility of free consent when you're faced with a situation of overwhelming force. So I assert that social contract theory is contradictory at its heart. That is, the state creates a situation in which consent is not only not at the bottom of its legitimacy, but is conceptually precluded. And in fact, the state makes virtually no sincere attempt to get anybody's consent. Now, let me just say that Locke's view that the state rests on the actual consent of the governed is an anarchist view. So Locke says this in the second treatise of government: man being, as has been said, by nature, all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. All right. Now, that, as explicitly as possible, makes every legitimate political system a completely voluntary situation. It asserts that no one can have their natural liberty taken away from them except by their own agreement. Right? Well, that is the anarchist position. Right? It's just that it has nothing to do with the way any actual state has actually exercised power. So much for contract theory. And next we'll deal with some of the utilitarian justifications of state power, including that of Hume.